Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. And it shall be abrupt. It's beginning to be very abrupt. It's already underway. Many will deny this. Many will hide from this truth. Many will shrug their shoulders and say, what are you going to do? Many will avoid it. Many will deride you for talking about it. Oh, and I think I lost something I wanted to talk about. Excuse me. Oh, this is what it was. So here we go. I'm just going to jump into more evidence of why this is actually happening and not a hoax, not a figment of anybody's imagination. It's not pessimism. It's not being negative. It's not looking at the bright side. It is what it is. And you cannot do anything about it or face life in any meaningful way unless you're aware of the reality of what's going on around you. You can try for a little while, but that's about how long it's going to last. Starting with this, someone posted this in the comment section, and I forgot who. Thank you for posting this. This is from an interesting website called Grit Post, Real News for the Working Class. Top climate scientist says humans will go extinct if we don't fix climate change by 2023. By my clock, that's 5 years. This is from February 19th, 2018. Top climate scientist is warning that climate change will wipe out all of humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years. In a recent speech at the University of Chicago, James Anderson, a professor of atmospheric chemistry at Harvard University, warned that climate change is drastically pushing Earth back to the Eocene epoch from 33 million BCE, when there was no ice on either pole. Anderson says current pollution levels have already catastrophically depleted atmospheric ozone levels, which absorb 98% of ultraviolet rays, to levels not seen in 12 million years. So he's talking about UV rays, and this is great because this is a subject that a lot of people are concerned about, and I don't think I just don't see as much in the scientific community I don't see as much talk or focus put on the UV ray problem. So let's read that again. Anderson says current pollution levels have already catastrophically depleted atmospheric ozone levels, which absorb 98% of ultraviolet rays to levels not seen in 12 million years. Anderson's assessment of humanity's timeline for action is likely accurate. Given that his diagnosis and discovery of Antarctica's ozone holes led to the Montreal Protocol of 1987, Anderson's research was recognized by the United Nations in September of 1997. He subsequently received the United Nations Vienna Convention Award for Protection of the Ozone Layer in 2005, and has been recognized by numerous universities and academic bodies for his research. While some governments have made commitments to reduce carbon emissions, Germany has pledged to cut 95% of carbon emissions by 2050. Anderson warned that those measures were insufficient to stop the extinction of humanity by way of a rapidly changing climate. Instead, Anderson is calling for a Marshall Plan style endeavor in which all of the world takes extreme measures to transition off of fossil fuels completely within the next 5 years. And we have heard this the idea of a Marshall Plan style endeavor many times. Will it happen? Is the $1 trillion, billion, quadrillion dollar question. Recovery is all but impossible, he argued, without a World War II-style transformation of industry, an acceleration of the effort to halt carbon pollution and remove it from the atmosphere, and a new effort to reflect sunlight away from Earth's poles. This has to be done, Anderson added, within the next 5 years. The chance that there will be any permanent ice left in the Arctic after 2022 is essentially zero. Anderson said, with 75 to 80% of permanent ice having melted already in the last 35 years. Anderson's prediction of Arctic sea ice disappearing by 2022 may be closer to reality than a lot of us would hope. In 2016, University of Reading Professor Ed Hawkins compiled global temperature data dating back to 1850. Prior to the Industrial Revolution of the early 20th century and the oil boom, and turning the data into a time-lapse GIF. The most alarming part of the data showed that temperatures began rising exponentially faster at the start of the 21st century and show no signs of slowing down. This GIF in here, quite interesting. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. I have seen it before. And it is extremely alarming. The good news is that there are a relatively small amount of culprits responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions, meaning governments know who to focus on. As Gritpost reported in July of 2017, more than half of all carbon emissions between 1988 and 2016 can be traced back to just 25 fossil fuel giants around the world. Was that many? 10 of those 25 top emitters are American companies, meaning the onus is largely on the United States to rein in major polluters like ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Marathon Oil. Other offenders include Chinese companies extracting and burning coal, and Russian oil conglomerates like Rosneft, Gazprom, and Lukoil. However, the bad news for humanity is that as long as Donald Trump is president of the United States, swift action to combat climate change seems unlikely prior to 2020. Given that Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords and refuses to even acknowledge the threat of climate change despite warnings from the U.S. government agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. He knows, he knows, he knows. And that is the end of that article. Short and to the point. Oh, and darn it, if I didn't lose the article I wanted to read. Here we go. Pardon me. Having browser problems. But they are not too bad. Okay. Moving on, this is an article that I wanted to read yesterday, but I ran out of time. Warned 30 years ago, global warming is in our living room. This is all over the place. It was on the AP News, ABC, CBS. This is from June 18th, 2018. We were warned. On June 23rd, 1988, a sultry day in Washington, James Hansen told Congress and the world that global warming wasn't approaching, it had already arrived. The testimony of the top NASA scientists, said Rice University historian Douglas Brinkley, was the opening salvo of the age of climate change. 30 years later, it's clear that Hansen and other doomsayers were right, but the change has been so sweeping that it is easy to lose sight of effects large and small. Some obvious, others less conspicuous. Earth is noticeably hotter, the weather stormier and more extreme, polar regions have lost billions of tons of ice, sea levels have been raised by trillions of gallons of water, far more wildfires rage. Over 30 years, the time period climate scientists often use in their studies in order to minimize natural weather variations, The world's annual temperature has warmed nearly 1 degree, 0.54 degrees Celsius, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And the temperature in the United States has gone up even more, nearly 1.6 degrees. The biggest change over the last 30 years, which is most of my life, is that we're no longer thinking about just about the future, said Kathy Dello, a climate scientist at Oregon State University in Corvallis. Climate change is here, it's now, and it's hitting us hard from all sides. Warming hasn't been just global. It's been all too local. According to an Associated Press statistical analysis of 30 years of weather, ice, fire, ocean, biological, and other data, every single one of the 344 climate divisions in the lower 48 states, NOAA groupings of countries with similar weather, has warmed significantly, as has each of 188 cities examined. The effects have been felt in cities from Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the yearly average temperature rose 2.9 degrees in the past 30 years, to Yakima, Washington, where the thermometer jumped a tad more. In the middle, Des Moines, Iowa, warmed by 30.3 degrees since 1988. South Central Colorado, the climate division just outside Salida, has warmed 2.3 degrees on average since 1988, among the warmest divisions in the contiguous United States. When she was a little girl 30 years ago, winery marketing chief Jessica Shook used to cross-country ski from her Salida doorstep in winter. It was that cold, and there was that much snow. Now she has to drive about 50 miles for snow that's not on mountaintops, she said. T-shirt weather in January, that never used to happen when I was a child, Shook said. When Buell Maddox bought his heating and cooling system company 15 years ago in Salida, he had maybe 4 air conditioning jobs a year. Now he's got a waiting list of 10 to 15 air conditioning jobs long and may not get to all of them. And then there's the effect on wildfires. Veteran Salida firefighter Mike Sugaski used to think a fire of 10,000 acres was big. Now he fights fires 10 times as large. You kind of keep saying how can they get much worse? But they do, said Sugaski, who was riding his mountain bike on what usually are ski trails in January this year. In fact, wildfires in the United States now consume more than twice the acreage they did 30 years ago. The statistics tracking climate change since 1988 are almost numbing. North America and Europe have warmed 1.89 degrees, more than any other continent. The northern hemisphere has warmed more than the southern, the land faster than the ocean. Across the United States, temperature increases were most evident at night and in summer and fall. Heat rose at a higher rate in the north than the south. Since 1988, daily heat records have been broken more than 2.3 million times at weather stations across the nation, 500,000 times more than cold records were broken. Doreen Pollock fled Chicago cold for Phoenix more than 2 decades ago. But in the past 30 years, nighttime summer heat has increased almost 3.3 degrees there. She said when the power goes out, it gets unbearable, adding, be careful what you ask for. Also to note, this is my aside, there's a nuclear power plant outside of Phoenix that is cooled by wastewater from Phoenix. If you don't understand the problem with that, the major problem with that, and the fact that it's landlocked, Phoenix is not a good place to be if the power goes out for a really long time. And who knows, typically I think the winds would blow eastward if they were blowing a nuclear meltdown. So that would affect states east of Arizona, but we're not all that far. Los Angeles is not that far from Phoenix. We're 6 hours away, so 6 hours away by car. When you look at the globe as a whole, especially since 1970, nearly all the warming is man-made, said Zeke Hosfather of the independent science group Berkeley Earth. Without extra carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, he said, the Earth would be slightly cooling from a weakening sun. Numerous scientific studies and government reports calculate that greenhouse gases in the big picture account for more than 90% of post-industrial Earth's warming. The AP interviewed more than 50 scientists who confirmed the depth and spread of warming. Clara Desser, climate analysis chief, having problems reading right there. Climate analysis chief of the National Center for Atmospheric Research said that when dealing with 30-year time periods in smaller regions than continents or the globe as a whole, it would be unwise to say all the warming is man-made. Her studies show that in some places in North America, though not most, natural weather variability could account for as much as half of the local warming. But when you look at the globe as a whole, especially since 1970, nearly all the warming is man-made, said Zeke Hausfather of the independent science group. I read this before, I'm sorry. Numerous scientific studies and government's reports calculate that greenhouse gases in the big picture account for more than 90% of post-industrial Earth's warming. Sorry about that. I had to take some breaks during this video because I'm trying to negotiate some other work. It would take centuries to a millennium to accomplish that kind of change with natural causes. This, in that context, is a dizzying pace, said Kim Cobb, a climate scientist at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Since the 1800s, scientists have demonstrated that certain gases in Earth's atmosphere trap heat from the sun like a blanket. Human activities such as the burning of coal, oil, and gasoline are releasing more of those gases into the atmosphere, especially carbon dioxide. U.S. and international science reports say that more than 90% of the warming that has happened since 1950 is man-made. Others cautioned that what might seem to be small increases in temperature should not be taken lightly. 1 or 2 degrees may not sound like much, but raising your thermostat by just that amount will make a noticeable effect on your comfort, said Deke Arndt, NOAA's climate monitoring chief in Asheville, North Carolina, which has warmed nearly 1.8 degrees in 30 years. Arndt said, average temperatures don't tell the entire story. It's the extremes that those changes bring. You aren't kidding. The nation's extreme weather, flood-inducing downpours, extended droughts, heat waves, and bitter cold and snow has doubled in 30 years, according to a federal index. The northeast extreme rainfall has more than doubled. Brockton, Massachusetts had only one day with at least 4 inches of rain from 1957 to 1988, but a dozen of them in the 30 years since, according to NOAA records. Ellicott City, Maryland, just had its second 1,000-year flood, 2 1,000-year floods back-to-back in little less than 2 years. And the summer's named Atlantic storms, on average, the first one now forms nearly a month earlier than it did in 1988, according to the University of Miami Hurricane Center researcher Brian McNulty. The 14 costliest hurricanes in American history, adjusted for inflation, have hit since 1988, reflecting both growing coastal development and a span that included the most intense Atlantic storms on record. The collective damage done by Atlantic hurricanes in 2017 was well more than half of the entire budget of the Department of Defense, said MIT's Carrie Emanuel. And that's an interesting number to keep in mind. Climate scientists point to the Arctic as a place where climate change is most noticeable, with dramatic sea ice loss. A melting Greenland ice sheet, receding glaciers, and thawing permafrost. The Arctic has warmed twice as fast as the rest of the world. Alaska's annual average temperature has warmed 2.4 degrees since 1988 and 5.4 degrees in the winter. Since 1988, Utqiagvik, Alaska, formerly known as Barrow, I'm gonna pause again, excuse me. Climate scientists point to the Arctic as a place where climate change is most noticeable, with dramatic sea ice loss. A melting Greenland ice sheet, receding glaciers, and thawing permafrost, the Arctic has warmed twice as fast as the rest of the world. Why am I rereading? I think this article keeps skipping. Sorry. Since 1988, Ute-Vik, Alaska, formerly known as Barrow, has warmed more than 6 degrees yearly and more than 9 degrees in winter. The temperature change is noticeable. Our ground is thawing, said Mike Amont, 73, the city's former acting mayor. He had to move his own cabins at least 4 times because of coastal erosion and thawing ground due to global warming. We live the climate change. The amount of Arctic sea ice in September, when it shrinks the most, fell by nearly 1/3 since 1988. It is disappearing 50 years faster than scientists predicted, said Michael Mann, a climate scientist at Pennsylvania State University. There is a new Arctic now because the Arctic Ocean is now navigable, at times in the summer, said Mark Serez, director of the National Snow and Ice Data Center. The vast majority of glaciers around the world have shrunk. A NASA satellite that measures shifts in gravity calculated that Earth's glaciers lost 279 billion tons of ice, nearly 67 trillion gallons of water, from 2002 to 2017. In 1986, the Begich Bogs Visitor Center, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, at Alaska's Chugach National Forest opened to highlight the Portage Glacier, but the glacier keeps shrinking. You absolutely cannot see it from the visitor center, and you haven't in the last 15 years or so, said climatologist Bryant Brettschneider of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica have also shriveled, melting about 455 million tons of ice into water, according to the NASA satellite. That's enough to cover the state of Georgia in water nearly 9 feet deep. And it is enough, coupled with all the other melting ice, to raise the level of the seas. Overall, NASA satellites have shown 3 inches of sea level rise in just the past 25 years. With more than 70% of the Earth covered by oceans, a 3-inch increase means about 6,500 cubic miles, or 27,150 cubic kilometers of extra water. That's enough to cover the entire United States with water about 9 feet deep. Imagine that, if you will. It's a fitting metaphor for climate change, said scientists. We're in deep and getting deeper. 30 years ago, we may have seen this coming as a train in the distance, Noah's Ark said. The train is in our living room now. And to wind up this video, so article I wanted to get to, well, a bunch of people sent me kind of the same article or news about fishing, although this says it's from February 22nd. New maps show the utterly massive imprint of fishing on the world's oceans. Humans are now fishing at least 55% of the world's oceans, an area 4 times larger than the area occupied by humanity's onshore agriculture. That startling statistic is among the findings of a unique high-tech collaboration that is providing a massive amount of new data about global fishing operations. The results, published Thursday in the journal Science, offer a powerful glimpse of the problem of overfishing on the hard-to-regulate high seas. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, 31.4% of global fish stocks were overfished or fished unsustainably as of 2013, while another 58.1% were fully fished. Thursday's findings relied on data from Global Fishing Watch, collaboration encompassing Oceana, SkyTruth, and Google. Researchers compiled billions of data points from tracking systems that the International Maritime Organization requires for about 70,000 fishing vessels. The result was a picture of fishing that the study, led by David Kreutzma of Global Fishing Watch, says has never been directly quantified. Because of data limitations, the percentage of the ocean's fish could be as high as 73%, the study said. Fishing is happening almost everywhere and all the time, said Jackie Savitz, Chief Policy Officer for the advocacy group Oceana. I think people don't really have a sense of how heavily fished our oceans are and how intensely they are fished. She said the intensity of global fishing documented by Thursday's study is far greater than researchers have been able to track in the past. That means we're putting more pressure on fish populations, Savitz said, noting that increased fishing also means more inadvertent catching of other species, such as sea turtles. That means there's more pressure on the oceans than we thought. There was particularly intense fishing off the southeastern coast of South America, the eastern coast of China, Western Africa, and all around Europe and the Mediterranean, the research found. The North Atlantic, far northeastern Pacific, Indian Ocean, and Southern Ocean were far more devoid of fishing. Here's one image of a fishing pattern off the coast of the northeastern United States and Canada. While Thursday's study itself doesn't delve into what areas are being overfished around the world, Savitz said experts have long documented overfishing in many places. So that's all I'm going to read of this article. I'm going to link it below, and I'm realizing that this was not necessarily the article that I wanted to read, but that's fine. You guys understand what's going on. Maybe this is the article that I wanted to read. Guys, there are so many articles to read and to look at and so much information. There's just no way for me to get a proper handle on everything. I just kind of like wade through the info as best I can and try to make it cohesive as best I can. Climate change is already sparking a new era of fishing wars, study finds. This is from the Huffington Post on June 14th. Fish are migrating more than 40 miles per decade as the oceans heat up, pushing populations into fisheries where other countries have exclusive rights and setting the stage for an era of surging international conflict, the new research has found. Unless greenhouse gas emissions decrease rapidly, 70 countries are projected to contain one or more new fishery stocks in their exclusive offshore economic zones by the end of the century, according to a study published Thursday in the peer-reviewed journal Science. Making the findings more dire, there are no international organizations with the existing power to broker new deals to share the fish, raising the risk of overfishing and destructive tension between neighboring countries. It's like two kids facing off after the last piece of cake, said Malin Pinsky, the study's lead author and an ecologist at Rutgers School of Environmental and Biological Sciences in New Brunswick, New Jersey. If they both race for it, it's likely they're going to get frosting and cake smeared all over the table and not as much cake for everyone, as opposed to cutting the cake neatly and sharing it. Yes, but we're talking about the global population of fish, meaning it's not good if all the cake is gone, right? Right. The fishing wars have already begun. In the mid-1990s, increasing warming in the Pacific Ocean pushed salmon south from British Columbia into the United States waters, causing the so-called salmon war to erupt between Canada and the U.S. And for years, Canadian fishermen tried to maximize their catch by targeting salmon heading south, leading to overfishing. By 1997, the conflict became physical as angry Canadian fishermen blockaded an Alaskan ferry, and the British Columbia provincial government sued the U.S. The two countries only settled on new sharing agreements after the suit was dropped in 2000. In 2007, Iceland and the Faroe Islands dramatically increased their annual quotas for mackerel as the striped, silvery fish's massive schools shifted northward into the Nordic nations' cooler waters. Scotland, backed by the European Union, fiercely protested the moves, and Scottish fishermen who depend on mackerel catches blockaded a Faroese ship, preventing it from unloading its haul. One Scottish politician accused Iceland and the Faroe Islands of acting just like their Viking ancestors by plundering fish stocks. The conflict lasted years and ultimately derailed Iceland's plan to join the European Union. Wow. Even now, there is conflict between the U.S. states. New Jersey has fought a years-long battle to convince federal regulators to increase its quotas for summer flounders, newly abundant in its waters since migrating north from North Carolina, where fishers traditionally depended on large hauls of the flatfish. These conflicts often don't stay in fisheries. They spill over, Pinsky said. This isn't a future problem. Yet, it's an issue with no current solution at the global level. The current legal framework for international regulation of fisheries does not account for fluctuating or changing distributions. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea serves as the primary foundation for international fishing rules and obliges states to cooperate to establish conservation and management measures. But the convention does not cover the sudden influx of additional species into new fisheries, creating a loophole that often allows newly fished stocks to be heavily exploited before meaningful standards are developed, Pinsky wrote in the paper. Regional fishery management organizations, which are subject to the UN Convention, would be the most reasonable venue for new sharing agreements between countries, Pinsky said, but there's no ongoing effort to convince regional fishery management groups to put stronger legal mechanisms in place to oversee species moving from one jurisdiction to another, or increase information sharing between countries to better track how climate change is affecting the populations. The Commission for Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources could be a model for these groups going forward. The group forged agreements with neighboring regional fishery management organizations to monitor the movement of stocks across regulatory frontiers and worked with regulators to put precautionary rules in place over new fisheries, including no-take zones. They actually do have quite far-sighted rules and mechanisms in place, Pinsky said. All right. I'm going to skip to the end here. Pinsky worked with a team of 5 other researchers and social scientists to review historical examples of shifting species between countries and organizations. He partnered with Richard Cadell, a fishery policy scholar at Utrecht University in Netherlands, to analyze current rules on sharing fish stocks around the world. He then compared fish stocks movements for 892 different commercially important fish and invertebrates to 2 different scenarios run through 3 separate global climate models, one based on current projections for increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and another based on meeting the moderate Paris Agreement goal of only 2.6 degrees Celsius warming above. So now the Paris Agreement goal is that Fahrenheit or Celsius? No, that's Celsius. So now it's 2.6 degrees? Okay, slip that one right in there. The projections show grave warnings. Even under low temperature scenarios, between 40 and 50 countries would be at risk of fishing conflicts as one or more stocks appeared in their exclusive zones, with aquatic animals migrating on average 10 times faster than land creatures as a result of climate change. Time for proactive policy planning is running out. Okay. I will link this in the description box below if you all want to check it out. Yeah, we also probably need to figure out if we, need to wholesale mitigate fishing, in general, because clearly we are just plucking fish out of the ocean, and it doesn't matter who's doing it. It's a problem. But yeah, obviously as the climate changes, as temperatures warm, as things become scarce, and they will, we're going to have major problems. Probably more major problems than just who's fishing what fish. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Hope to be back tomorrow, although tomorrow's looking unlikely. Maybe Sunday I'll be back with another video. Until next time, peace.